Well, the first thing to write down is that Africa is where all human life begins. Based upon all the scientific evidence that we have right now, we can trace that Africa is where human life began. Now, in this class, I'm going to use the word evolution here. I know this can be a little bit controversial out there, but in world history, the same as our biology class here, we will be talking about evolution. So if there are people out there who have religious beliefs that are different than evolution, what I would say is you may talk to your minister, talk to your priest about that. If you have questions about how this pertains to the Catholic faith here at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School, I'd recommend you talk to your religion teacher. Father, any one of our Jesuits who are working here, you may talk to them. But we're just going to use evolution as a scientific theory here. So how do we know that life actually begins in Africa? Well, what you do is, basically you look at the fossils. You look at where the oldest human remains are. And basically when you're doing this, you start digging the dirt, and the further you go down, generally, the older fossils get. So when we do that, we can trace this, and we can see that almost all the oldest fossils are found in Africa, and they're found particularly in the eastern and southern part of Africa. This would be around the regions of Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Kenya is where you would find, this is where you would find the oldest fossils. And what we find is that, again, Africa is the cradle of civilization. This is where all people come from. So this happens in modern humans, which we call Homo sapiens. They started about 200,000 years ago. And then we see that 200,000 years ago, that's an estimate. Some people put it old as 1,000,000 years ago, but we're going to use 200,000 years for this class. Now what happens is 70,000 years ago, people start moving out of Africa. So we see as humans, we live the first 130,000 years of being modern Homo sapien humans in Africa. If I just do a quick math problem on that, I find that about 65% of human life was in Africa, and only Africa. And then we see that people start moving out. They go to into Saudi Arabia, right around here, into Europe, all the way down to Australia. They cross the Bering Strait by Alaska and Russia, go into the Americas, and this is how all people branch out. But again, we do things like radiocarbon dating. We find that the oldest fossils, again, are found in Africa, and that is where we point that all human life begins. All right, let's look at our next one here on hunter-gatherer societies. So the first humans were hunter-gatherers, which meant basically they were either hunting their food or they were gathering it. We're going to watch a video on that in class from Guns, Germs, and Steel, which will show where Professor Jared Diamond goes to Papua New Guinea, and he actually lives with and studies hunter-gatherer societies there. And we find out here, you look at this comic here, you see the kind of like the caveman looking guy right here, and you see he's going into the hunters. Well, primarily, most of the men were hunters, and most of the women were gatherers. Now, as Professor Jared Diamond says, actually gatherers was probably the harder job. It was harder to be a gatherer than it was to be a hunter. I think it was more work. Hunters were extremely important as well. You need protein for your diet, and hunting is where you would get that. So this is how the first people lived. So when we look at hunters, gatherers, and we look at humans as Homo sapiens, we've lived for about 190,000 years as modern humans. And 200,000 years as modern humans. We've lived for 200,000 years as modern humans. 190,000 of those years, we were hunters and gatherers. The scientific evidence shows, if we look at the first civilizations of Mesopotamia, in Egypt, we didn't even really start living in cities until 10,000 years ago. So 95% of human history, we were hunters, gatherers, and nothing else. 10,000 years ago, we started to stop being hunters and gatherers. We started to form our cities again. You can find these in Samaria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and, these are the earliest ones we know of. Maybe there were earlier ones in Africa. We don't know. That's where human life began. This is where, if you're going to be like an archaeologist, a historian, an anthropologist, Africa is a really interesting place to go because there are lots of room for new discoveries to be made all over the continent. Anyway, there are still hunter-gatherers today, and this is not just in Africa. The hunter-gatherers today are mainly on 3 continents. In South America is where you'd find a huge number in the Amazon rainforest as far as numbers go, but just because of the area they have there. What's fascinating about the hunters-gatherers in the Amazon rainforest is that some of them have no outside contact besides the rainforest. They basically live in the rainforest. And if I would meet like one of them, one of the people who are living in the middle of the rainforest, have never met someone from outside, they might die from meeting me. Probably they would. It'd probably be something like smallpox or another disease that they're very vulnerable to because they've only lived with their people. They haven't had the cultural diffusion, the mix of other societies. So that's one huge group of hunters-gatherers would be in the Amazon rainforest. Places like Papua New Guinea and Asia have hunters-gatherers, and you will find some in Africa, like the Efe, who live in the Democratic Republic of Congo today. Now, hunters-gatherers live in small groups. They typically have to live in groups of about 10 to 100 people. The men hunt typically, and the women gather food. And they're nomadic, which means they move from place to place to place. Now, because that, they're moving often with like the animals that they're hunting. Because they're moving, because they have to travel in small groups, marriages are interesting between a lot of hunters and gatherers. If you got a group of 10 to 100, it typically is kind of like a clan, which means it's kind of like a family. So you can't really intermarry in that group. So what happens is hunters-gatherers, what they'll do is they'll meet another group of hunters and gatherers, and they'll kind of do, for the most part, in most societies, it would be like a bride swap. Literally, women would leave one of the groups and then marry into another hunter-gatherer group and leave their family and leave basically what is their society and join another one. And this happens in many hunter-gatherer societies throughout history. There's mostly, it seems that it's mostly the women who would get exchanged as brides. There may be examples where this happened with the men, but I do not have that. Okay, I don't have that in my research. All right, continuing, people, again, over time, domestication happened. Domestication pretty much means making something tame so you can control it. So domestication, if you think about that, that kind of stops hunting and gathering, but think about how ingenious it was for the people who first domesticated animals. I mean, like pigs are domesticated animals, seen in farms, but they come from wild hogs. And wild hogs have, if you've ever seen one, they have teeth, they have actually horns, they have fur on them. They are mean wild animals. So it's amazing that people actually had the thought process of maybe just instead of hunting one, we should catch one. Then, if it's a female, find a male for it, have babies, and we will, basically eat their babies, or at least some of their babies, and raise them. That's a process that must have taken hundreds, if not thousands of years to actually happen. Or a plant. I mean, think about a seed. Like the patience it takes for the first people who've never grown a plant before, that I'm going to take this little thing on the plant, put it in the ground, water it, watch it grow. As one of my students said in the class, they probably think it may have been an accident at first. And then eventually over time, trial and error, you learn, you start changing the crops and everything, but this is a very long process for domestication, which kind of ends hunting gathering after a while. Last thing I'm going to say about hunters-gatherers is they are completely sustainable. If you are a hunter and a gatherer, you could pretty much do this. If we did this to the people, we could pretty much do this forever. I mean, yeah, you might gather too much in one area, but then you move on. And that allows the plants or animals to come back. So 95% of human history we lived like this, and if we were all hunter-gatherers today, we wouldn't really need environmentalists because we wouldn't be damaging our environment. It's only in the last 10,000 years, which is 5% of modern Homo sapien life, that we've gotten away from this. So hunter-gatherer life is totally sustainable.